Asterisk, asterisk. Part I Silver Hollow pushes her out. Asterisk, asterisk. The autumn of 1878 arrived in Silver Hollow, Colorado, not with a gentle sigh, but with a sharp, biting wind that carried the red dust of the high plains and the promise of an early, unforgiving winter. It was a wind that chapped the skin and worked its way into the soul, a constant reminder that in this part of the world, survival was a negotiation, never a guarantee. For Anna O'Rourke, the wind felt less like a promise and more like a verdict. She walked down the town's main thoroughfare, a wide, rutted track that was either a river of mud or a cloud of dust, depending on the day. Her basket, woven from sturdy willow, was empty on her arm. Her posture was straight, a habit from her years as a schoolteacher, though it felt more like a conscious act of defiance now. Her chin was held a fraction higher than necessary, a small shield against the world. She was 28, a widow for 2 years, and in the eyes of Silver Hollow, she was a problem. The whispers followed her like her own shadow, curling from behind parted curtains and rising from the boardwalks where men in dusty hats and women in starched bonnets paused their conversations to watch her pass. Asterisk, there she goes. Asterisk, the murmurs would say. Asterisk, the troublesome widow. Asterisk. She was troublesome because she had not remarried. She was troublesome because she had not sold her late husband Liam's plot of land just outside of town, a stubborn patch of earth the railroad barons were beginning to eye with considerable interest. Most of all, she was troublesome because she carried her grief not with the loud, public performance the town expected, but with a quiet, unyielding dignity that they mistook for arrogance. They could not penetrate her sorrow, and so they resented it. Her destination was the Silver Hollow Mercantile, a long, low building that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and lye soap, the scent of civilization, however tenuous. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door, the small bell above it jangled, announcing her arrival. The store's proprietor, a balding man named Mr. Abernathy, stopped stacking tins of peaches and gave her a curt nod, his eyes darting away as if her gaze might burn him. But it wasn't Mr. Abernathy who commanded the room. Standing near the counter, like two pillars of civic virtue, were Mayor Silas Crowell and Mrs. Prudence Hart. Crowell was a man built like a barrel, his waistcoat straining against the buttons that held his considerable girth in check. His face was perpetually flushed, a testament to fine whiskey and a short temper. Beside him, Prudence Hart, the banker's wife, was as thin and brittle as a dried cornstalk. She was the town's self-appointed moral compass, and her needle always pointed toward condemnation. They turned as Anna entered, and a predatory stillness fell over the store. Mayor Crowell cleared his throat, a sound like gravel turning in a bucket. He was holding a piece of paper. "Mrs. O'Rourke," he began, his voice booming with false piety, "Providence has brought you here. The town council, with the full endorsement of the church's moral committee, has convened on a matter of some urgency." Prudence Hart sniffed, a small, sharp sound of approval, a matter concerning public decency. Anna stood her ground, her hand tightening on the handle of her basket. She knew this was not a social call. Mayor, Mrs. Hart. Her voice was steady, calm, betraying none of the cold dread that was beginning to seep into her bones. Crowell unfurled the paper with a dramatic flourish. "It has come to our attention," he read, his eyes scanning the document but his words clearly memorized, "that your continued presence in Silver Hollow presents a challenge to the virtuous character of our community. As an unattached woman, living without proper oversight, your conduct has been deemed a source of potential scandal. A few other customers in the store, a ranch hand and a miner's wife, suddenly found the sacks of flour at the back of the store intensely fascinating. Anna felt their averted gazes like a physical weight. "My conduct?" she asked. her voice dangerously quiet. "And what conduct would that be? Mayor tending my husband's grave, reading by my own lamplight." Prudence Hart stepped forward, her lips a thin, merciless line. "It is what your independence implies, child. It sets a poor example. It gives men notions. A town like ours, a beacon of progress and faith, cannot abide such a stain on its reputation." The word progress hung in the air. Anna knew exactly what kind of progress they meant. The kind that came on iron rails and devoured small plots of land owned by troublesome widows. "Therefore," Crowell concluded, his voice rising to a crescendo, "the council has passed a resolution. For the good of the community, and for the preservation of your own soul, you are hereby given 7 days to vacate your property and leave the jurisdiction of Silver Hollow." The silence that followed was absolute. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like hammer blows. 7 days. Winter was coming. The wind howled outside, as if to underscore the finality of the sentence. Anna's first instinct was to scream, to rail against the monstrous injustice of it. But she choked it down. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she focused on a crack in the wooden floorboards. Tracing its jagged path with her eyes, she drew a breath, then another, until the fire in her chest subsided to a hot, hard coal of resolve. "You have no right," she said, her voice low but clear, carrying to every corner of the silent store. "We have every right," Crowell shot back. "The right to protect our town from moral decay. The papers are filed. It is done." He held out the document. She didn't take it. She simply looked at him, her gaze so direct and unwavering that he, the powerful mayor, was the first to look away. Then she turned her gaze to Prudence Hart, whose mask of piety seemed to crack under the scrutiny. Finally, Anna turned and walked out of the store, the bell jangling softly behind her, a sound like a closing gate. As she stepped back into the biting wind, a wagon rumbled past. The driver, a kind-faced man named Thomas Garvey, tipped his hat. He slowed his team just enough to speak without being obvious. "Mrs. O'Rourke," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You be careful. The mayor keeps company with the Doolin brothers, Pike and Lyle. They ain't the kind for paperwork." He clucked to his horses and the wagon moved on, leaving Anna with a new layer of fear icing over her anger. The Doolins were hired muscle, known for their quick fists and dull wits. They were the tools men like Crowell used when legal documents weren't enough. That afternoon, she didn't go home. She walked the winding path up to the small cemetery overlooking the town. The wind was stronger here, whipping her skirts around her legs and tearing at the pins in her hair. She knelt before a simple wooden cross marked *Liam O'Rourke. She laid a hand on the weathered wood. "They're trying to run me off. Liam," she whispered to the wind and the soil. "They want our land. They're using my name, our name, to do it. They're calling my grief a scandal." She traced the letters of his name, the simple, honest wedding band on her finger cold against her skin. It was all she had left of him. That and the land. The ring was a promise to the past. The land was supposed to be a promise for the future. "I won't let them," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I won't sell your memory for their railroad. I won't sell my dignity for their approval. I don't know how, but I will find a way." High on a ridge to the west, where the pines began their thick march up the slopes of the Elk Mountains, a man on horseback watched the town through a small spyglass. His name was Elias Boone. He was a man in his mid-30s, with the quiet stillness of someone who spent more time with trees than with people. He had seen Anna O'Rourke walk into the mercantile and seen her walk out, her back as straight as a gun barrel. He'd seen the way Crowell and the banker's wife stood on the boardwalk afterward, preening like vultures over a fresh kill. He lowered the spyglass, his expression unreadable. He'd seen this kind of play before, in different towns, with different actors. Greed dressed up in the clothes of morality. He'd seen men with more steel in their eyes than Anna O'Rourke break under less pressure. But she hadn't broken. He noted that, filed it away. He wasn't a man to meddle in the affairs of towns. He had come down from his mountain cabin for salt, coffee, and cartridges. Nothing more. He turned his horse, intending to ride a wide circle around the town's poison and head back to the solitude of the high country. But he didn't. He waited, watching the sun dip lower, a silent, solitary figure against the vast, indifferent sky. Night fell on Silver Hollow like a thrown blanket, snuffing out the light and amplifying the cold. Anna sat in her small cabin, a single lamp casting a warm but lonely circle of light. She had eaten a little bread and cheese, more out of necessity than appetite. Every creak of the floorboards, every skittering sound on the roof, sent a jolt of fear through her. Tom Garvey's warning about the Doolin brothers echoed in her mind. The knock on her door was not a knock. It was a heavy, impatient thud. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Mrs. O'Rourke," a low, gravelly voice called from outside. "We know you're in there. Mayor Crowell sent us to finalize some business." She didn't move, didn't breathe. The thudding came again, harder this time. "Open the door, or we'll open it for you." Slowly, she rose and moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. Two large, hulking shapes stood on her porch, their faces obscured by the brims of their hats, the Doolins. Before she could think, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of the yard. It was a single man, and he moved with a disturbing, fluid grace. He wasn't large like the Doolins, but there was a coiled tension in his presence that was far more intimidating. "She doesn't want company," the newcomer said. His voice was quiet, yet it cut through the wind. The Doolin brothers turned. Surprised, "Who in the hell are you, Pike?" The larger one growled. "Just a passerby," the man said. "But it seems to me the lady said no." Lyle Doolin laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This ain't your business, mountain man. Shove off before you get hurt." The stranger didn't move. He simply stood there, a silhouette against the faint starlight. There was a long, tense silence. Anna watched, her breath caught in her throat. As the Doolins seemed to have a silent conference, they had come for an easy intimidation, not a real fight with an unknown quantity. With a string of muttered curses, they stomped off the porch and disappeared into the night. The stranger lingered for a moment, his gaze fixed on her door, before he too melted back into the darkness. Anna waited, her body trembling, for what felt like an eternity. Who was he? Just as the terror began to subside, she saw a slip of white paper slide under her door. Her blood ran cold. Had they come back cautiously? She picked it up. The handwriting was a crude, angry scrawl. Asterisk leave or disappear. The threat was no longer veiled in legal resolutions or moral pronouncements. It was stark, brutal, and real. She sank into her chair, the paper trembling in her hand. The walls of her small home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. She was alone, cornered, with winter and violence closing in. A soft thud on her windowsill made her jump. She crept to the window and looked out. There was nothing but the wind-tossed branches of the lone cottonwood in her yard. But resting on the sill was a small canvas sack. She hesitated, then slowly unlatched the window and drew it inside. She brought it to the lamp. It was heavy, and the rich, dark aroma that emanated from it was unmistakable. Coffee, a full pound of it. There was no note, no name. It was just a simple, anonymous act of kindness in the face of calculated cruelty. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a promise of safety. But as she clutched the sack to her chest, the warmth of the beans seeping through the canvas, it felt like something almost as important a recognition, a sign that somewhere out in the vast, hostile darkness, someone had seen her, and for the first time that day, Anna O'Rourke didn't feel entirely alone. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 2. The Mountain Man's Invitation. Asterisk, asterisk. Dawn broke thin and gray, the light struggling to pierce the oppressive cloud cover. Anna hadn't slept. She sat at her small table, the threatening note laid flat beside the sack of coffee. The two objects were a perfect summary of her situation, a stark, ugly threat, and a quiet, inexplicable kindness. The clock on the mantel ticked away the seconds of her 7-day reprieve. With each tick, the world shrank a little more. She could run, but where? To another town just like Silver Hollow, where a lone woman was an object of suspicion. The thought of it was a lead weight in her stomach. A knock came at the door. It was not the brutal thud of the Doolin brothers, but a firm, solid rap, patient and sure. She froze, her hand flying to her throat. She crept to the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. It was him, the stranger from the night before. In the flat morning light, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was not a giant, as she had imagined in the dark, but lean and wiry, built of sinew and bone rather than brute muscle. He wore buckskins, worn smooth with use, and a heavy wool coat against the cold. His hair was dark and a little too long, and his face was all angles, weathered by sun and wind. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a clear, steady gray, the color of a winter sky, and they held a deep, unnerving calm. He stood on her porch not with the arrogance of the town's men, but with the quiet patience of a hunter waiting for a sign. He held his hat in his hands, taking a breath that did little to calm her. She unbolted the door and opened it a crack. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a low baritone, slow and deliberate, as if he weighed each word before speaking it. "You're the man from last night," she stated, her voice a little shaky. He gave a slight nod. "My name is Elias Boone." She waited for him to say more, to explain why he had interfered, why he had left the coffee, why he was standing on her porch now, but he just waited, his gray eyes watching her, not with pity, but with a kind of sober assessment. "Why did you help me?" she finally asked. "Didn't seem like a fair fight," he said simply. He gestured with his head back toward the town. "And I don't hold with men who do their talking with fists in the dark." He paused, then got to his purpose. "I heard what the mayor did in the Mercantile." Of course he had. News in a town this size traveled faster than a prairie fire. "I have a cabin up in the Elk Mountains," he said, his gaze direct, without a hint of guile. "It's warm. It's safe. You can stay there until you figure out what it is you want to do. No one from town will bother you." The offer hung in the cold air between them, astonishing in its simplicity and profound in its implications. Every lesson she had ever been taught, every rule of propriety, every whisper of caution screamed at her to slam the door in his face. A woman did not go into the wilderness with a man she did not know. It was social ruin. It was dangerous. The men of the town saw a mountain man as half wild, a savage living on the fringes of their civilized world. But what had their civilization offered her? A public shaming, an eviction notice, and a threat of violence. She looked at Elias Boone's weathered face, at his calm, steady eyes, and she saw none of the leering condescension of Mayor Crowell or the smug cruelty of Prudence Hart. She saw something else, something she couldn't quite name. Stillness, competence. Her internal war was fierce but brief. Fear of the unknown was a powerful thing, but the fear of the known of the Doolins, of freezing on the road, of having her last shred of dignity stripped from her was worse. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elias seemed to consider the question for a long moment. "Because I know what it's like to have a place," he said finally, "and I know what it's like to have it threatened. Everyone deserves a spot to stand where the wind can't blow them over. Come or don't, but decide soon. A storm's brewing in the high country, and Crowell won't let you sit for 7 days. He was right. The threat on the paper wasn't a warning. It was a promise. She made her decision. It felt less like a choice and more like stepping off a cliff. hoping the man below was telling the truth about the ground being solid. "Give me an hour," she said. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and walked away without another word, melting back toward the edge of town where his horse was likely tethered. Anna packed quickly. There was little to take: a change of clothes, her mother's sewing kit, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, and the simple silver-backed brush Liam had given her on their first anniversary. She wrapped them all in a heavy wool blanket. She looked around the small cabin, at the life she and Liam had started to build. It was already a ghost. With a heavy heart, she banked the fire, latched the window, and slipped out the back door, leaving the key on the sill where the coffee had been. Elias was waiting where the path to the woods began, holding the reins of a sturdy-looking pack mule and his own horse, a powerful buckskin that watched her with intelligent eyes. He took her bundle without comment and secured it to the mule. "We'll follow Miller's Creek for a ways," he said, helping her onto the mule. His touch was brief and impersonal. "The ground is soft near the water. It'll hide our tracks for a while." As they moved away from Silver Hollow, the sound of the church bell ringing for the morning service faded behind them. With it, Anna felt the oppressive weight of the town's judgment begin to lift, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of pine and the vast, intimidating silence of the wilderness. The journey was harder than she could have imagined. They didn't follow established trails. Elias led them through dense thickets of aspen and up steep, rocky inclines. He moved with an economy of motion that she, in her city shoes and long skirts, could not hope to match. He was constantly watching, his senses attuned to the world around them in a way that was entirely new to her. "See there," he murmured, pointing to a gathering of dark, heavy clouds clinging to the highest peaks. "That's snow. It'll be down here by nightfall." He pointed to a patch of scraped bark on a pine tree. "Elk, sharpening his antlers. He's close." He taught her to see the land not as a landscape, but as a language. A bent twig, a dislodged stone, the cry of a jay, everything had meaning. He showed her how to test the thin sheet of ice at the edge of the creek with a stick before letting the mule drink, its surface crackling in protest. At midday, they stopped in a sheltered ravine. Elias started a small, smokeless fire with a skill that seemed like magic to her. He produced dried venison and hard biscuits from his saddlebags. As they ate, he laid out the terms of their arrangement, his voice as practical as if he were discussing the price of flour. "The cabin has one main room and a sleeping loft. The loft is mine. The room is yours. There's a good stove, and the wood pile is stocked for the winter. I have traps set for rabbit and snare lines for grouse. We won't go hungry." He looked at her directly. "This is a sanctuary. Mrs. O'Rourke, not a prison. You contribute what you can cooking, mending, keeping the fire, and I'll handle the rest. There are no other expectations, no obligations. When you decide you want to leave, I'll take you wherever you need to go. Is that clear?" "It is," she said, humbled by his straightforward respect. He hadn't called her Anna. He was maintaining a formal distance, a boundary that was as clear and solid as a locked door. "And please, call me Anna." He considered this. Elias, then. He pulled a small object from his coat pocket. It was a heavy brass compass, its surface worn smooth with time. He opened the lid. "We're heading northwest. Another 3 hours, maybe 4. As he held it, the low sun caught the inside of the lid, revealing a faint, hand-etched inscription. E.S. "My father's," he said, noticing her gaze. "Elijah Samuel Boone. He said a man without a compass is just a man who's lost, whether he's in the mountains or standing in the middle of a city." He closed it with a soft click and put it away. It felt like a rare glimpse into the man behind the quiet exterior. Back in Silver Hollow, Mayor Silas Crowell was in a rage. He paced the floor of his office, his face the color of a ripe plum. "Gone. What do you mean? Gone, he roared at Pike Doolin, who stood shuffling his feet by the door. his hat clutched in his big, dumb hands. Just that mare. Her cabin's empty. Fire's cold. Looks like she cleared out early this morning. Prudence Hart, who had been summoned to the mayor's office, clicked her tongue in disapproval. I knew she was a flighty, unreliable sort. This proves her poor character. Character be damned. Crowell slammed his fist on his desk, making a stack of papers jump. That land was supposed to be secured. The railroad agent is arriving in 2 weeks. I need her signature on that transfer document. We can find her, Lyle Doolin offered, stepping forward from the shadows. She's a woman alone. How far can she get? She wasn't alone, Pike corrected, a little nervously. Saw tracks, a horse and a mule. Looked like she had help. Mountain man, maybe. The tracks headed up toward Miller's Creek. Crowell's eyes narrowed. Boone. He spat the name like a curse. That hermit, always lurking on the edge of things. He has no business interfering. He turned to the brothers, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. Find her. Find him. Get her back here. I don't care how you do it. Persuade her to sign the papers. Remind her how precarious life can be for a woman without protection. The Doolin brothers shared a grim smile. This was the kind of work they understood. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, cold shadows across the trail. Elias reined in his horse. They were at the edge of a wide, shallow stream, the water running clear and fast over a bed of smooth, gray stones. We're close now, he said, his voice low, but he wasn't looking ahead. He was looking down. Anna followed his gaze. There, pressed into the soft mud on the opposite bank, were tracks. Not the delicate cloven prints of a deer or the heavy tread of a bear. These were horseshoe prints. 2 horses, shod with town iron. One set of tracks was deeper than the other. The prints dug in and clumsy, as if made by a heavy, impatient rider. They cut directly across the stream, heading in the same direction they were going. Who is it? Anna asked, her voice tight with renewed fear. Elias didn't answer immediately. He dismounted and knelt by the tracks. Touching the edge of one of the impressions, "The mud is still wet," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. They passed less than an hour ago. It's the Doolins. The sanctuary he had promised suddenly felt a very long way off. The violence of Silver Hollow had followed them. Elias stood up, his face grim in the fading light. We need to move. Now. He led them across the stream and into the deep woods on the other side, his calm replaced by a focused urgency. 10 minutes later, they emerged into a small, hidden meadow. And there, nestled against a sheer rock face and sheltered by a stand of ancient pines, was the cabin. It was not large, but it was built to last, made of thick, expertly notched logs, chinked snugly with dried moss and mud. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from its stone chimney, a sign that he had been there earlier to start a fire. A stack of firewood, taller than a man, stood against one wall, but it was the door that caught Anna's eye. It was made of heavy, polished pine, and into its surface, someone with a patient hand and a sharp knife had carved the image of a tall, spreading pine tree, its roots digging deep into the wood. It was a symbol of everything she had lost and everything she hoped to find a place to stand firm, a home. As Elias unlatched the heavy door and pushed it open, revealing a warm, fire-lit interior, Anna stepped over the threshold. The cold dread of the Doolins' pursuit was still fresh, a knot of ice in her gut. But for the first time in 2 years, she felt the unmistakable, life-giving sensation of coming home. Part 3, Learning to Live for the Sake of Living. The first 48 hours in the cabin were a siege, not against men, but against the mountain itself. The storm Elias had predicted rolled down from the peaks with the fury of a charging army. Wind screamed through the pines, and snow, thick and wet, began to plaster itself against the single window pane, turning the world outside into a churning vortex of white. The threat of the Doolin brothers, so immediate just hours before, was dwarfed by the elemental power of the blizzard. Inside, the cabin was a bastion of warmth and security. The stone fireplace, built with a deep hearth and a strong draft, consumed seasoned pine logs with a steady, hungry roar. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, drying wool, and the faint, lingering aroma of the coffee Elias had brewed. Anna, who had spent the last 2 years feeling exposed and vulnerable in the heart of a town, found a strange and profound sense of safety in this isolated box of logs, miles from any soul but the quiet man who now occupied its periphery. Elias moved with a purpose that seemed to be an extension of the cabin itself. He checked the chinking for drafts, secured the heavy wooden bar across the door, and brought in a final armload of wood before the snow became too deep. He worked in a focused silence, and Anna found herself watching him, learning the rhythm of his self-sufficiency. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. He was a man who understood his world and his place in it. The loft where he slept was a simple platform under the eaves, accessible by a sturdy ladder. He ascended it each night with his bedroll, leaving the entirety of the main room to her. It was a clear, unspoken delineation of space that she was deeply grateful for. He had offered her sanctuary, not intimacy, and his every action reinforced that promise. When the storm finally broke on the third morning, the world was transformed. Every branch was laden with a heavy blanket of snow. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue, and the silence was so profound it seemed to have a physical weight. The Doolins, if they had tried to follow, would have been turned back or buried. For now, they were safe. And so their life began, measured not by the church bell of Silver Hollow, but by the rising and setting of the sun. The week that followed was a blur of labor, a constant, shared effort against the encroaching winter. Survival, Anna learned, was not a grand, dramatic battle, but 1,000 small, necessary tasks performed day after day. Her hands, accustomed to the delicate work of holding a pen or a book, were soon raw from the rough handle of the splitting axe. Elias showed her how to read the grain of a log, where to place the wedge, how to bring the maul down with the weight of her body, not just her arms. The first few logs she split were a clumsy, frustrating affair, but Elias was a patient teacher. He never raised his voice, never showed impatience. He would simply take the axe, demonstrate the motion again, and say, "Let the tool do the work." Slowly, she found the rhythm, the sharp bite of the steel into wood, the satisfying crack as the log yielded, the clean, resinous smell of the fresh split pine. With each swing, she felt a piece of the town-bred helplessness fall away, replaced by a hard-won, aching competence. They worked together to replaster the stone chimney with a mixture of clay and dried grass Elias had prepared, their hands often brushing as they passed the trowel back and forth. Anna would feel a jolt at the brief contact, the calloused warmth of his skin against hers, but his expression never changed. He was focused only on the task, on making their shelter sound and secure. He brought in a fine buck one afternoon, and the cabin was filled with the metallic scent of fresh meat. He taught her how to smoke the venison into jerky, slicing it into thin, uniform strips and hanging it on racks near the ceiling, where the warm air from the fire would slowly cure it. He showed her the root cellar, a dark, cool space dug into the earth beneath the floorboards, where they stored sacks of potatoes, carrots, and turnips he had harvested before the first frost. This, he explained, was their insurance against starvation. In the evenings, the world shrank to the circle of light cast by the fire and a single oil lamp. The howling of the wind was a constant companion, a reminder of the wildness just outside their door. But inside, a quiet domesticity took root. Anna would take out her sewing kit and mend the rips in her dress or patch a thin spot in her stockings. One evening, she noticed a frayed cuff on Elias's heavy wool sweater. "Take that off," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. He looked up from the knife he was sharpening. Surprised, he hesitated, then did as she asked. The sweater was heavy and smelled of pine smoke and the cold mountain air. She took it and, using a strand of her own dark hair for thread, began to weave the cuff back together with small, neat stitches. He watched her, his gray eyes unreadable in the flickering firelight. Her sewing needle, a small, delicate instrument, moved with a sureness that mirrored the way he handled his hunting knife. They were two different tools, from two different worlds, both wielded with a quiet, practiced skill, both necessary for keeping a life from unraveling. When she was finished, she handed it back to him. He ran a thumb over the repair, a line of dark thread against the worn gray wool. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. The next day, as she was carrying a bucket of water from the creek, the wire handle, rusted and thin, finally gave way, sending icy water splashing down the front of her skirt. She let out a cry of frustration, more at her own sodden misery than at the broken bucket, before she could even begin to assess the damage. Elias was there. He took the bucket from her without a word, disappeared into a small shed behind the cabin, and returned 20 minutes later. He had fashioned a new handle from a sturdy piece of hickory, sanded smooth and attached with clever loops of repurposed wire. It was stronger than the original. "Thank you," she said, her voice mirroring the quiet gratitude he had shown her the night before. Their conversations in those fire-lit evenings were hesitant at first, two strangers testing the boundaries of each other's solitude. Anna would read aloud from her book of sonnets, her teacher's voice clear and melodic in the rustic quiet of the cabin. Elias would listen, his head tilted, as if the words were a foreign music he was trying to understand. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds asterisk. She read one night. Or bends with the remover to remove asterisk. "That's a fine sentiment," Elias said into the silence that followed. "But love is a luxury out here. Trust is the currency." He, in turn, would tell her stories of his life. But they were curated, the darkest chapters left unread. He spoke of his time as a scout during the war, but he described the lay of the land, the taste of hardtack, the bone-deep cold of a winter in the Shenandoah Valley. He never spoke of the fighting. He never mentioned the men he had seen fall, or the things he had been forced to do to survive. The war was a locked room inside him, and he only ever opened the door a crack, letting her see the dusty furniture but never the ghosts that inhabited it. Anna, in return, told him about her schoolhouse, about the bright, eager faces of the children, the smell of chalk dust, the small triumphs of teaching a boy to read his first full sentence. She spoke of Liam, not with the raw grief that had silenced her in Silver Hollow, but with a gentle, reminiscent fondness. She told him how they had met, how they had dreamed of building a life on that small plot of land. Talking about it here, in this safe, quiet place, felt less like reopening a wound and more like tending a memory. Through these shared stories and shared labors, a change began to occur. Anna felt it in herself first. The constant fear that had been her companion for 2 years began to recede, replaced by a growing sense of confidence. She asked Elias to teach her more. She wanted to know how to read the clouds, how to find north by the stars, how to set a simple snare for a rabbit not for sport, but for the profound knowledge of being able to provide for oneself. "There's no need," he told her. "I can provide for us both." "It's not about need, Elias," she countered, her gaze steady. "It's about not being helpless. I never want to be helpless again." He saw the steel in her eyes, the same quiet defiance he had seen that day in the mercantile, and he relented. He began to teach her the deeper language of the mountains, and she, in turn, was teaching him. Her presence, her quiet resilience, her stories of a world of books and children, began to chip away at the fortress of solitude he had built around himself. He found himself smiling, a slow, unaccustomed stretching of his lips, at a witty observation she made. He found himself listening for the sound of her footsteps, for the soft hum of her voice as she read by the fire. The profound, lonely silence of his cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with a life that was not his own. And he discovered, to his own astonishment, that he did not mind. One evening, as dusk was painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of lavender and rose, Elias stood by the window, gazing out at the valley below. He was watching the smoke from their own chimney rise straight and true in the still air. But his eyes were drawn to something else, far down, in a narrow ravine that cut between two foothills. He saw another plume of smoke. It was thin, almost invisible against the darkening sky. But it was there, and it was wrong. A seasoned trapper or a Ute hunter would build a small, hot fire that produced little smoke. This was the lazy, gray smoke of a larger, carelessly built fire, the kind made by men who were unaccustomed to the wilderness and unconcerned about being seen. "What is it?" Anna asked, coming to stand beside him. He didn't answer right away. His body tensed, the old instincts of the scout taking over. "Company," he said at last, his voice low and hard, and not the welcome kind. The peace of their small world was shattered. The distant howl of a lone wolf, which had once sounded like a song of freedom to Anna, now sounded like a warning. The threat they had outrun had found them again. The next morning, well before dawn, Elias was gone. He left a pot of coffee on the hearth and a simple instruction: "Don't leave the cabin. Bar the door. Don't build up the fire until I return." Anna spent the day in a state of suspended anxiety, her ears straining for any sound beyond the drip of melting snow from the eaves. She paced the floorboards, the sewing needle and the book of sonnets lying forgotten on the table. The skills she had been so proud to learn, how to split wood, how to make a fire, seemed like children's games in the face of this real, unseen danger. He returned just as the sun was setting, slipping out of the deep blue shadows of the forest like a ghost. He was carrying his long rifle, and his face was set in grim lines. "2 men," he said, leaning the rifle against the wall and accepting the cup of coffee she handed him. "They've made a crude camp down in the ravine. They're clumsy, loud, not mountain men." He took a long drink from the cup, his eyes dark with thought. "How do you know?" she asked. He looked down at his own worn, soft-soled moccasins, then at her sturdy but scuffed leather shoes. "I circled their camp, found their tracks leading down to the creek." He paused, and his gray eyes met hers. "They're wearing town boots, heavy ones, with iron nails in the soles." The implication was as cold and hard as a shard of ice. This wasn't a random pair of prospectors or lost travelers. The men in the ravine, the men who had built the careless fire, were from Silver Hollow. Crowell had sent them. Her fragile sanctuary had been found. The respect that had built a home within these 4 walls was about to be tested by the greed that had driven her from her own. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 4 Storm on the Elk Mountains. Asterisk, asterisk. The uneasy peace inside the cabin lasted less than an hour. The knowledge of the Doolin's presence in the ravine settled between Anna and Elias like a third person, silent and menacing. Every snap of the fire, every groan of the logs, sounded like a footstep outside. But the first move came not from the men in the valley, but from the sky. A change in the wind was the first sign. The gentle downdraft from the peaks ceased, and a low, mournful moan began to snake through the pines. The brilliant blue of the sky curdled, turning the color of a day-old bruise. Elias, standing by the door, sniffed the air. "Get the water buckets full," he said, his voice flat and urgent. "All of them. And bring in the rest of that kindling. It's here." It was a different kind of storm from the one that had greeted her arrival. This was no mere snowfall. It was a blizzard, a true high-country maelstrom. Within minutes, the air was a blinding chaos of wind and ice. The snow didn't fall, it flew horizontally, sharp as sand, hitting the cabin walls with a sound like 1,000 tiny fists. The world beyond the window vanished. There was no mountain, no forest, only the shrieking, white abyss. The cabin, which had felt so solid and secure, now seemed like a fragile ship in a furious sea. It groaned under the assault, the timbers complaining as the wind hammered against them. A frigid draft, sharp as a knife, snaked under the door. Anna grabbed a spare blanket and stuffed it into the gap, her fingers numb from the cold that seemed to radiate from the very logs themselves. They fell into a rhythm born of necessity. Elias checked the shutters, adding a second wooden bar to the one on the window. Anna methodically went over the chinking near the fireplace. Packing loose spots with clay Elias had stored in a bucket, they portioned out their food a small bit of jerky and a single boiled potato each. The fire was the heart of their survival, and they tended to it with the reverence of priests at an altar, feeding it logs sparingly, preserving the precious heat that stood between them and the lethal cold. Hours bled into one another. The roaring of the wind was a physical presence, a constant pressure on the eardrums that made conversation impossible and thought difficult. They communicated with gestures and nods, two isolated souls fighting a common, implacable enemy. In the thick of the storm's fury, the human threat lurking in the ravine felt distant, almost irrelevant. No man, Anna thought, could move in this. She was wrong. It was Elias who heard it first, in a brief lull. When the wind momentarily drew a breath, he stiffened. He held up a hand, his head cocked, his entire being focused on the sounds beyond the wall. Anna strained her ears, hearing nothing but the storm's receding howl. "What is it?" she mouthed. He put a finger to his lips. His gray eyes narrowed. He crept to the door, pressing his ear against the thick wood. And then she heard it too. A muffled crunch. Another. It was the sound of heavy boots breaking through the icy crust of the deep snow, unnervingly close. The Doolins, they were using the storm's chaos as cover, assuming the occupants of the cabin would be deafened and blinded. A cold, sharp terror, colder than any draft, pierced through Anna. They were trapped. The storm that was their enemy had also become their prison. Elias's face was a mask of concentration. He looked at his rifle, mounted on the wall, then looked at Anna, and a flicker of something, a deep reluctance, passed through his eyes. He was not a man who sought violence. He turned away from the gun. His eyes scanned the room, landing on a spool of thin but strong fishing line and a string of small brass bells Anna had used to decorate the mantel for Christmas a lifetime ago in another world. An idea took shape in his eyes. Moving with a silent, deliberate speed, he gestured for her to stay away from the window. He unspooled a length of the line, tied one end to the string of bells, and then, with incredible stealth, he unbarred and opened the cabin door just a crack enough to slip his hand out into the maelstrom. The wind screamed into the room, bringing with it a blast of ice and snow. For a terrifying minute, he fumbled in the blinding whiteness. He was tying the other end of the line to a loose handle on the woodpile, creating a nearly invisible tripwire a few feet from the porch. He pulled the door shut, rebarred it, and took his position in the shadows by the fireplace, holding the bell end of the line taut. They waited. The silence in the cabin was now as loud as the storm outside. The crunching sounds grew louder, closer. Two distinct sets of footsteps. A low, guttural voice, snatched away by the wind. They were just beyond the woodpile. Suddenly, a loud, frantic jangling of bells echoed through the cabin, impossibly sharp and alien amidst the storm's roar. It was followed by a startled curse from outside, a heavy thud as a man went down. "What in the—" Pike Doolin's voice was a confused bellow. Before Lyle could answer, Elias acted again. He grabbed a heavy iron skillet from its hook and brought it down hard on a stack of tin plates, creating a deafening crash. Jedediah Elias shouted, his voice a powerful roar that seemed to come from a different man entirely. He directed his shout toward the loft. "They're at the woodpile, cover the back." He then strode to the other side of the cabin and banged his fist on the log wall, yelling, "Hold your fire! Boys, wait for my signal!" Outside, there was a moment of panicked confusion. The unexpected bell, the crash, the sound of a strong voice commanding unseen men. It painted a picture of a cabin that was not just occupied, but well defended by a prepared group. The Doolins had come expecting to intimidate a lone mountain man and a helpless widow. They had found an armed garrison. There were more muffled curses. The sound of men scrambling back the way they came, their clumsy retreat a testament to their surprise and fear. Elias waited, line still in hand, for a full 5 minutes after the last sound had faded. Then, and only then, did he allow his body to relax. He let the line go slack, the bells falling silent. The adrenaline drained out of Anna, leaving her trembling, her knees weak. She sank onto the small wooden stool by the hearth, wrapping her arms around herself. They were safe, for now. But the sheer, calculated cleverness of Elias's ruse, his choice of strategy over bloodshed, left her breathless. The storm raged on for the rest of the night, a constant, howling reminder of their isolation. But the atmosphere inside the cabin had changed. The immediate threat had passed, leaving behind an electric awareness of their shared survival. They were no longer just a man and a woman occupying the same space. They were partners who had faced down a common enemy and won. Late into the night, the fire burning low, Elias rose to check a shutter that was rattling violently on the small covered porch. Unable to sit still, Anna pulled her shawl tighter and followed him into the semi-shelter of the overhang. The wind was less a direct assault here, but the cold was staggering. The air was thick with flying ice crystals that stung her cheeks. The sheer, untamed violence of the blizzard, visible just beyond the edge of the roof, was both terrifying and magnificent. She hugged herself, rubbing her arms, but the cold had sunk deep into her bones. Her hands were numb, her fingers aching. She began to shiver, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that was as much from the lingering shock as from the cold. Elias finished securing the shutter and turned to her. He saw the way she was shaking, her face pale in the faint light spilling from the cabin. His expression softened. Beside the door, a heavy, cured deerskin was slung over a peg to keep it dry. He took it down. It was thick and supple, the hide of the buck he had brought in a week before. Wordlessly, he draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was immediate, a comforting pressure. The hide, which had retained some of the cabin's warmth, began to seep into her clothes, a slow, welcome heat against her chilled skin. She pulled the edges of it around her, the soft fur lining a luxury against her neck. She looked up to thank him, but the words died in her throat. He was looking at her with an intensity that made the storm around them fade to a distant whisper. The guarded calm in his gray eyes was gone, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently adjust the deerskin on her shoulder, his calloused fingers brushing the wool of her dress. "Silver Hollow looked at you and saw a nuisance," he said, his voice a low rumble, barely audible over the wind. He shook his head slowly. "Fools. All of them." He finally met her eyes, and the connection was so profound it felt like a physical touch. They gave the mountain man the woman no one wanted, but he saw what they couldn't. The words were a confession, a validation, a balm on every wound the town had inflicted upon her spirit. He saw her, not the troublesome widow, not the unbeseeming woman, not the obstacle to progress. He saw her asterisk, and in his eyes she saw her own worth reflected back, clear and undeniable. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. The space between them vanished. She didn't know who moved first. His hand came up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. The gesture was infinitely tender. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not born of passion or of loneliness, but of a deep, resonant recognition. It was gentle, questioning, and as deeply respectful as every other action he had taken since she'd met him. It was a promise of safety, a confirmation of worth, a quiet claiming in the heart of the storm. She leaned into him, her cold hands resting on the solid warmth of his chest, the deerskin a protective cloak around them both. The world outside shrieked and raged, a tempest of chaos and destruction. But on the small wooden porch of the cabin, a profound and unshakable stillness had finally taken root. The next morning, the world was born anew. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of impossible beauty and silence. The snow was piled in deep, sculpted drifts, and every surface glittered under a brilliant, cloudless sun. The air was so cold and clean it felt like breathing stars. A new warmth existed between them, a comfortable silence that needed no words. The boundaries had shifted. The space between them now charged not with tension, but with a quiet, glowing affection. After a breakfast of coffee and jerky, Elias went out to inspect the area, his rifle in hand. He returned a few minutes later, his expression grim. "Their tracks are gone," he said. "Snow covered everything, but they left something behind." He held up a piece of paper, stiff with ice. He had found it in a snowdrift on the porch, right where one of them must have dropped it in their hasty retreat. They brought it inside to thaw by the fire. It was a document, printed with official-looking lettering. Though the lines were slightly crooked, it was a legal summons, ordering one Anna O'Rourke to return to the jurisdiction of Silver Hollow to appear before a magistrate concerning the final settlement of her late husband's estate. It was filled with threatening legal phrases, designed to frighten and confuse. Anna's heart sank. It was another weapon, another attempt to force her back into their grasp. But Elias, holding the paper close to the light, pointed to the bottom where the magistrate's signature was supposed to be. "Look," he said. A small drop of melted snow had landed on the signature, causing the black ink to bleed slightly into the paper. He leaned in and sniffed it. "This ink is fresh," he said, his voice certain. "It still has the smell of the lampblack. A real court document would have been signed weeks ago. The ink would be dry, cured. This was written last night, in their camp." He crumpled the false summons in his fist. It was a forgery, a desperate, clumsy ploy. The Doolins hadn't just been driven off by a clever trick. They had been forced to reveal the weakness of their position. All they had left were lies and hollow threats, their deceptions as flimsy as a piece of paper against the unyielding truth of the mountains. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 5, The Truth in Denver. Asterisk, asterisk. The week after the storm passed, in a state of watchful quiet, the discovery of the forged summons had changed the nature of their solitude. It was no longer a simple sanctuary from the world, but a strategic position in a silent war. The Doolins were gone. For now. But the shadow of Mayor Crowell and his unseen ambitions loomed larger than ever. The warmth that had blossomed between Anna and Elias on the porch that night remained. A gentle, unspoken current that flowed through their shared tasks and quiet evenings. But beneath it ran an undercurrent of tension, the knowledge that this fragile peace could not last. The world intruded on the 10th day. It arrived not with the clumsy thud of a hired thug, but with the determined, rhythmic crunch of a single person making their way up the trail on snowshoes. Elias heard them first, of course. He was outside, splitting the last of the logs from a fallen aspen when he froze. His head lifted, listening to something beyond the range of Anna's hearing. He gave a low whistle, a prearranged signal, and Anna immediately barred the cabin door from the inside, her heart beginning a familiar, heavy beat. Elias retrieved his rifle from where it leaned against the woodpile and melted into the deep shadows of the pines at the edge of the clearing, becoming just another patch of darkness against the snow. Anna watched from the small, cleaned patch on the window, her breath fogging the glass. The figure that emerged from the tree line was not what she expected. It was a woman, tall and slender, dressed in a practical man's traveling coat and sturdy, high-laced boots. A determined-looking hat was pinned to her dark, upswept hair. She moved with a brisk, no-nonsense energy, her gaze sweeping the clearing, taking in the cabin, the smoke from the chimney, and the tracks in the snow with a sharp, intelligent assessment. She stopped at the edge of the clearing and called out, her voice clear and strong, carrying easily in the still, cold air. Anna O'Rourke. My name is Ada Whitfield. I'm an attorney from Denver. I was sent by Tom Garvey. I mean you no harm. An attorney from Denver. The words made no sense. Anna glanced toward the trees where Elias was hidden, but saw no movement. The decision was hers. She took a breath, unbarred the door, and stepped out onto the porch, pulling her shawl tight against the cold. I am Anna O'Rourke, she said, her voice steady. The woman, Ada Whitfield, gave a small, appreciative nod. I had a feeling I'd find a woman who didn't scare easily. May I approach? Anna nodded, and the woman trudged the last few yards to the cabin. Up close, Anna could see the intelligence that shone in her dark eyes and the firm, resolute set of her jaw. This was a woman accustomed to being underestimated and accustomed to proving people wrong. Tom Garvey was worried, Ada began, getting straight to the point. He saw you leave town with a companion, and he knows Silas Crowell's character. When Crowell put the Doolins on your trail, Tom sent a wire to my office. He thought you might need a different kind of help than a man with a gun could offer. From the trees, Elias emerged, his rifle held loosely in one hand, its muzzle pointed at the ground. He had assessed the situation and deemed the visitor no threat. He gave Ada a slow, measuring look, and she returned it without a flicker of fear. Mr. Boone, I presume, Ada said with a wry smile. Tom described you as well. Quiet as a shadow and twice as hard to pin down. Elias just nodded, his face impassive, and leaned his rifle against the cabin wall. Please, Anna said, gesturing to the open door. Come inside. You've come a long way. Inside, by the warmth of the fire. Ada shed her coat and accepted a tin mug of hot coffee. She wasted no time on pleasantries. Mrs. O'Rourke, Anna, she said, her gaze direct. The reason Mayor Crowell is so desperate to remove you from Silver Hollow has very little to do with your late husband's plot of land. That is merely the excuse. She reached into her satchel and produced a thick sheaf of papers tied with a ribbon. She placed them on the table. This is the real reason. A last will and testament, filed in the Denver courthouse 12 years ago. I don't understand. Anna said, Liam left no will. We had nothing to leave. This isn't your husband's will, Ada said, her voice softening slightly. It belongs to your mother's sister, your aunt, Eleanor Vance. Anna stared at her, dumbfounded. She barely remembered her aunt, a woman who had gone west long before Anna was born, a figure spoken of in hushed, disapproving tones by her family back in Ireland. They had said she was headstrong, that she had chased foolish dreams. My aunt passed away 10 years ago, Ada continued. She never married, had no children. She was, by all accounts, an exceptionally shrewd woman in the 1860s, before the railroad boom truly began. She used what little money she had to purchase land use warrants along several proposed survey routes through the Colorado territories. It was a gamble. Most of them proved worthless, but one, Ada tapped the top document, one did not. The warrant she held covers a significant portion of the Elk Mountain Pass, the very same pass the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad now considers essential for their new expansion line. The room was silent save for the crackle of the fire. Elias stood by the hearth, motionless, but Anna could feel his attention focused entirely on the lawyer's words. According to her will, you, her only living relative, are the sole heir to those warrants. You are, For all intents and purposes, the legal gatekeeper to the railroad's most profitable new route. The scale of it was impossible to comprehend. It was a fortune, a power she had never dreamed of, and it was the reason for everything. The whispers, the resolution, the threats. Crowell found out. Anna breathed, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Precisely, Ada confirmed. He works for the railroad baron behind the expansion, a man named Asa Blackwood. They uncovered the will during a title search. Their plan was simple and vicious. First, they discredit you, isolate you. Then, they force you out, making it impossible for you to ever learn of your inheritance. If that didn't work, their next step was likely to coerce you into a marriage with one of their cronies, giving them legal control of your assets. They needed to neutralize you before you became aware of the power you hold. The false summons on the table suddenly made perfect, chilling sense. It was a desperate attempt to lure her into a legal trap where she could be declared incompetent or forced to sign papers she didn't understand. So what happens now? Anna asked, her mind reeling. Now, you claim what is yours, Ada said, her eyes flashing with a lawyer's fire. We go to Denver. We file the probate papers. We transfer the titles. And we serve an injunction against the railroad, forcing them to negotiate directly with you. We turn their own game of law and order against them. Denver. The word was a clang of iron, a cloud of coal smoke. It was a world of banks and courtrooms, of men in stiff collars and women in silk dresses who would look at her patched wool and Elias's buckskins with disdain. It was a world designed to make people like them feel small and powerless. She looked at Elias. His face was a closed book, but she saw the conflict in his eyes. He had offered her a sanctuary from the world, and now the world, in all its grasping complexity, was demanding she return to its center. I'll go with you, he said, his voice quiet but firm. It was not a question. The journey to Denver was a journey between worlds. They traveled by horse and mule to a small way station where they could board a train. The moment Anna stepped onto the carriage, she felt the familiar weight of society's gaze settle upon her. She was acutely aware of her simple, worn dress, of Elias's quiet, wild presence beside her. The screech of the train's whistle as it pulled away from the station felt like the cry of a new and rapacious age. An age of iron and contracts that was devouring the West she knew. Denver was a chaotic symphony of noise and ambition. Buildings of brick and stone rose 3, even 4 stories high, casting sharp shadows over streets thronged with carriages, carts, and a sea of people, all moving with a feverish urgency. After the profound silence of the mountains, the city was a physical assault on the senses. Elias walked through it all with a tense, guarded stillness, his eyes constantly scanning, not for the track of a deer, but for the unseen threats of a different kind of wilderness. Ada had secured them rooms in a respectable but modest hotel and had arranged for new clothes to be delivered, seeing herself in the mirror in a dress of dark, respectable serge, her hair pinned up in a fashionable style. Anna felt like she was looking at a stranger. The woman in the mirror looked poised, confident. Anna felt like an imposter. The legal work began at once. Days were a whirlwind of meetings in dusty law offices, of signing documents with a steel-nibbed pen until her fingers cramped, of learning a new language of trusts, endowments, and fiduciary duties. Ada was a brilliant and tireless guide, explaining every clause, every implication. Anna discovered a quickness of mind she hadn't realized she possessed. She began to see the law not as a weapon to be used against her, but as a tool she could wield. On Ada's advice, she began to structure her inheritance, setting aside large portions to establish a charitable trust. She envisioned a school for the children of Silver Hollow, and a fund to support the widows and families of miners killed in the ever-frequent collapses. It was her money, her power, and she would use it to build, not to hoard. The apex of their time in Denver was an invitation to a formal reception at the home of a prominent senator, a man whose support was crucial in the legal battle against the railroad. Ada insisted they attend. Blackwood will be there, she had said. It's time he sees he's not dealing with a helpless victim. The house was a palace of gaslight, crystal, and polished mahogany. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and cigar smoke. Men in black evening dress and women in jewel-toned silks moved through the crowded rooms, their voices a low, cultured murmur. Elias, looking deeply uncomfortable in a borrowed suit that fit him badly across the shoulders, stood near the wall, a glass of untouched punch in his hand. He looked like a wolf in a gilded cage, his eyes missing nothing, his posture radiating a profound sense of being out of place. Anna, on Ada's arm, moved through the glittering throng. She saw the curious, condescending glances sent her way. The whispers followed her here, too, but they were different from the ones in Silver Hollow. Here, she was not the troublesome widow, but the eccentric heiress, the strange mountain woman who had stumbled into a fortune. Asa Blackwood was exactly as she had imagined, a tall, imperious man with cold, calculating eyes and a predatory smile. He watched her from across the room, his expression one of amused contempt. But there was a flicker of something else in his eyes as he saw her standing beside Ada, calm and composed, a flicker of surprise. Later in the evening, the senator invited Anna to say a few words. A hush fell over the room. All eyes were on her. She walked to the center of the room, her heart pounding, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady. "I am told," she began, "that I have come into a great deal of wealth, and I have spent the last few days learning the language of that wealth, the language of stocks, and titles, and interest. But I grew up with a different understanding of value. I was taught that wealth is a warm hearth on a cold night. It is the dignity of a day's hard work. It is the trust of a good neighbor." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room of polite, predatory faces. "I find your world very loud, and I have learned that the loudest voices are often trying to distract from the quietest truths. Thank you for your hospitality." She finished with a simple nod and walked back to her place, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. It was broken by a sneering, youthful voice, a very charming speech. "Mrs. O'Rourke, so rustic, Robert Hart, Prudence Hart's slick, city-educated son," stepped forward, a condescending smirk on his face. "But one must wonder, if you hold such contempt for money, why have you come all this way to claim it so aggressively?" It was a trap, designed to make her look like a hypocrite. Anna met his gaze without flinching. "I hold no contempt for money, Mr. Hart," she replied, her voice calm and even. "I hold contempt for greed. Money is a tool. One can use it to build a cage, or one can use it to fashion a key. I have spent too much of my life in a cage. I am merely collecting my key." The quiet dignity of her response left him speechless. A ripple of impressed murmurs went through the crowd. From across the room, she saw Elias watching her, and for the first time that night, a slow, genuine smile touched his lips. It was a smile of pure pride. But the room, the noise, the suffocating press of bodies was too much for him. A short time later, she saw him slip quietly out a side door and disappear into the cool darkness of the gardens. She knew, with a pang in her heart, that he could not breathe here. He had come to this world for her, but he could never belong to it. He was a man of the mountains, a keeper of quiet places, and this gilded cage was as much a prison for him as Silver Hollow had been for her. Just before they were set to leave, Ada drew Anna aside, her expression grim. "A wire just came in from my contact in the county land office," she said, her voice low. "It's a rumor, but it's a strong one. Blackwood and Crowell are accelerating their plans. They're preparing to file a mass foreclosure action against half the small homesteads in the Silver Hollow Valley, citing a public development clause tied to the railroad's right-of-way. They're going to use the law to steal the entire valley." The news hit Anna like a physical blow. This was no longer just about her. Crowell and Blackwood weren't just trying to silence her. They were trying to annihilate her entire community. She had come to Denver to claim her power, to collect her key. Now, she realized, she would have to use it not just to free herself, but to save them all. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 6, A Fissure, and Fire in the Ravine, asterisk, asterisk. The train ride back from Denver was a jarring retreat from one world into another. The city's noise and ambition slowly gave way to the vast, open silence of the plains. But the quiet that settled between Anna and Elias was not the comfortable, easy silence of their cabin. It was a new and fragile thing, fraught with the unspoken questions of their future. The woman who had left Silver Hollow was a fugitive widow. The woman returning was a landed heiress, a force to be reckoned with. The man who had guided her was a protector. The man returning was what? Exactly. The question hung between them until their last night at the way station before the final ride up to the mountains. They sat outside the small, dusty inn, watching the stars emerge in the deep indigo sky, a spray of diamonds so vast and cold it made the world of men seem small and insignificant. Once Ada has the legal protections in place, Elias began, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Once you are secure in Silver Hollow, I'll be heading back up to the high country. The words were spoken softly, but they landed on Anna's heart like stones. She had assumed, foolishly perhaps, that they would return to the cabin together, that the life they had begun to build, a life of shared labor and quiet trust, was the beginning of a future. Back up, she asked, her voice tight. Alone. It's where I belong. Anna, he said, still not looking at her. I am a man of the mountains. That world in Denver, the parties, the lawyers, the money. That's your world now. You don't need a man like me to protect you anymore. The hurt was a sharp, physical pang in her chest. A man like you, what does that mean? And what if I don't want a protector? Elias, what if I want a partner? She reached for his hand, but he drew it away, as if her touch might burn him. You saw how I was back there, he said, his voice rough with a self-loathing she didn't understand, stuffed in a suit, walking on carpets. It's a cage. A man can't breathe in a cage. He finally turned to her, and the pain in his eyes was so profound it stole her breath. That life you're building, schools, charities, that's a clean life. It deserves a good man, not one who carries a past like mine. I don't care about your past, she insisted, her voice trembling. I care about the man who stood on my porch when no one else would. The man who taught me how to split wood and read the clouds. You don't know my past, he said, the words a final, shutting door. It's better that way. A fissure had opened between them, a deep and painful crack born of his own private demons and her newfound power. She was afraid that if they could not bridge it, she would lose him forever, not to the Doolins or the law, but to the ghosts that haunted him. They rode toward Silver Hollow the next day in a strained silence. The beauty of the landscape a mocking counterpoint to the ugliness of their unresolved conflict. They were met on the trail not by the Doolins, but by a frantic, dust-covered Tom Garvey. The kind-faced teamster's face was etched with panic. Thank God I found you, he cried, reining in his lathered horse. It's the homesteads, the ones in the West Ravine, they're on fire. Fire! Elias's focus sharpened instantly. His personal turmoil forgotten. An accident. No accident, Tom said, shaking his head, his eyes wide with horror. It's the Doolins. Folks saw them riding out that way just after dusk last night. They're burning people out. The Miller family, the Jensens, their cabins are gone. They're trying to create a panic. Force everyone to sell to Crowell for pennies before the foreclosures even get filed. Without another word. Elias spurred his horse into a gallop, Anna right behind him, her skirts flying, her inheritance, her legal battles. All of it seemed like an abstract game compared to this. This was fire and fear, and it was happening to her neighbors, to the people the town had deemed as unimportant as they had once deemed her. The scene in the West Ravine was a vision of hell. A thick, acrid pall of smoke hung in the air, burning the eyes and throat. 2 cabins were already reduced to smoldering, blackened skeletons. A third, belonging to a family named Clark, was fully ablaze, the flames roaring, devouring the dry timber with a terrifying hunger. People were screaming, running in panic, trying to save livestock or a few pathetic possessions from the inferno. Anna leaped from her mule before it even came to a stop. Her time in Denver, her transformation from victim to heiress, had forged a new resolve in her. She was no longer the woman who stood silent in the face of injustice. "Tom," she yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Get the women and children to the creek bed. Get wet blankets on them, you." She pointed to a stunned-looking farmer. "Start a bucket brigade. Don't try to save the house. Just keep the fire from spreading to the trees." She moved with an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. She tore a strip from her petticoat, soaked it in a water trough, and tied it around the face of a sobbing Mrs. Clark, whose husband was still, she cried, inside the burning cabin. Elias was already a shadow in motion. He swung off his horse, grabbing the splitting axe from his saddle. The front of the Clark cabin was an impassable wall of flame. He raced around to the back, where a small window was belching smoke. Without hesitation, he smashed the frame with the flat of his axe and disappeared inside. Anna's heart stopped. For a terrifying minute, there was nothing but the roar of the fire. Then, he reappeared at the window, dragging a soot-blackened, half-conscious Mr. Clark behind him. He hoisted the man through the opening and then vaulted out himself just as a section of the roof collapsed inward with a deafening crash, sending a fountain of embers into the sky. As Anna and Tom Garvey helped carry Mr. Clark to safety, Elias's eyes scanned the chaos. He saw it at the edge of the woods, a flicker of movement. A man on horseback, holding a lit torch, about to ride toward the next cabin down the line. It was Pike Doolin. Elias moved with the deadly speed of a striking snake. He vaulted onto his own horse and charged, not toward the fire, but in a wide, cutting arc to head off Pike's escape. Pike saw him coming and wheeled his horse around, his face a mask of snarling fury. He dropped the torch and drew a large pistol from his belt. Anna screamed a warning, but it was lost in the din. Pike fired, the shot loud and sharp. The bullet whistled past Elias's head, close enough to stir the air. Elias didn't slow. He didn't draw his own weapon. Instead, as he closed the distance, he leaned low over his horse's neck and threw his axe. It flew end over end, not the sharp edge, but the heavy, flat side of the maul, and it struck Pike's gun hand with a sickening crunch. The pistol flew from his grasp. Before Pike could recover, Elias was upon him, launching himself from his own saddle in a flying tackle that sent both men crashing to the ground. They rolled in the dirt and mud, a whirlwind of desperate, brutal violence. Pike was bigger, a mountain of brute strength, but Elias was faster, harder, his every blow precise and disabling. The fight was short and savage. Elias ended it with Pike on his back, gasping for air. The sharp point of Elias's hunting knife pressed against his throat. For a long moment, they were frozen in a tableau of imminent death. Anna watched, her hand to her mouth, her blood running cold. She could see the battle raging in Elias's eyes. This was the man who had seen war, the man who knew how to end a threat permanently. She saw the ghosts of his past rise up, urging him to finish it, to cut the poison of Silver Hollow out at its root. And then, she saw him make a choice. The killing rage in his eyes subsided, replaced by a cold, hard control. He lowered the knife. From his belt, he uncoiled a length of rope. He was not a killer, not anymore. He rolled Pike onto his stomach, pulled his arms behind his back, and bound his wrists with a ruthless efficiency that spoke of long practice. He ended violence not with more violence, but with a knot. The fires were eventually brought under control, but not before 3 families had lost everything. As the exhausted homesteaders gathered, their faces smudged with soot and despair, Elias stood over his captive. The immediate danger was over, but the larger one remained. Later that night, as Anna tended to the burned hands of a young boy, Elias found her by the creek. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving them both hollowed out and weary. The fire had burned away the polite distance between them, leaving only the raw truth. "Now you see," he said, his voice quiet and raspy from the smoke. "Now you see the man I am." "I see a man who saved a life," she said, looking up at him, "and spared another." A shudder went through his powerful frame. He sank down onto a log beside her, burying his face in his hands. The confession, when it came, was a torrent, the bursting of a dam that had held back a lifetime of guilt. "During the war," he began, his voice muffled, "I was a scout. I knew the land better than anyone. My unit, they were hunting a band of raiders. I led them. I took them on a path I knew, a shortcut that ran past a small, peaceful village of Cherokee. They weren't warriors. They were farmers, families. I told my captain that. I warned him." He lifted his head, and the anguish in his eyes was a physical thing. He didn't listen. He saw them as the enemy. As we passed, some of his men, they broke ranks. They rode into the village. I didn't fire a shot. I just sat on my horse on the ridge, and I watched. I watched the smoke rise. I heard the screams. I did nothing." He looked at her, his soul stripped bare. "I guided them there. Anna, my knowledge of the land, the one thing I was ever proud of, led them to that place, that fire tonight. Seeing those homes burn, it was the same smoke, the same screams. Don't you see that poison is in me? It's what I run from. It's why I cannot stand in your world." Anna listened, her heart aching for the burden he had carried alone for so long. When he was finished, she didn't offer platitudes or easy forgiveness. She simply reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. His hand was rough and calloused, stained with soot and the grime of the fight, but she held it fast. "You were a boy, Elias," she said, her voice soft but firm. "A boy in a war you didn't start. You made a choice tonight. You had that man's life in your hands, and you chose mercy. That is the man I see. Not the boy on the ridge, the man by the creek. And that is the man I will not lose." He looked at their joined hands, then up at her face, and something in his own visage, a knot of pain he had held for a decade, finally began to loosen. Just then, Ada Whitfield arrived, accompanied by a federal marshal she had summoned from a nearby district. They took Pike Doolin into custody, a sullen, defeated prisoner. But as they searched his belongings, they found something more valuable than his gun. Tucked inside his saddlebag was a small leather-bound ledger. Ada brought it to the light of a lantern. Her eyes, sharp and practiced, scanned the neat columns of figures. "This isn't Pike's handwriting," she murmured. "It's too precise." The ledger detailed payments made to the Doolin brothers, but it was the notes in the margins that were most damning. They were meticulous instructions which homesteads to threaten, what rumors to spread, which supplies were needed, lamp oil, rags. It was the careful, detailed planning of a cunning mind. "Look at this entry," Ada said, pointing a finger at a familiar name. "Reimbursement for forged legal stationery. Paid to P. Hart." Anna stared at the name. P. Hart, Prudence Hart. She wasn't just the moral voice of the conspiracy, Ada said, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. She was its bookkeeper, the virtuous church-going Mrs. Hart was the one who recorded every dirty dollar, who wrote the threatening letters, who orchestrated the entire campaign of terror from behind her lace curtains. The revelation was staggering. The woman who had judged Anna so harshly for her supposed lack of virtue was a core architect of a plot built on arson and terror. The fire in the ravine had done more than destroy homes. It had burned away the last veil of civility, exposing the true, rotten heart of the corruption in Silver Hollow. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 7. The Climax of Flood and Judgment. Asterisk, asterisk. Winter did not release its grip on the Elk Mountains gently. It retreated with a violent shudder, a long, slow surrender that turned the high peaks into a ticking clock. The snowpack, which had been their shield and their prison, was now their greatest threat. As the spring sun grew stronger, the snow began to melt, not in a gentle trickle, but in a rush. The creeks and streams, sleepy under their winter ice, awoke with a furious roar. The people of Silver Hollow, accustomed to the seasonal cycle, watched the rising water with a nervous eye. But this year was different. The winter had been unusually harsh, the snows unnaturally deep. The ground, still frozen solid beneath the surface, could not absorb the runoff. Miller's Creek, the town's main artery, transformed from a clear, babbling brook into a churning, muddy torrent, carrying with it uprooted saplings and chunks of ice like battering rams. The climax of their battle with Silas Crowell was not to be fought with guns or legal papers alone. Nature itself, impartial and unforgiving, was about to become the final arbiter. The flood came at dawn. It began not with a wave, but with a sound, a deep, grinding roar from up the valley that was felt in the bones before it was heard by the ear. It was the sound of the earth giving way. A natural ice dam high in the ravine had broken. Within minutes, a wall of brown, debris-filled water surged down the canyon, swamping the creek banks and pouring into the low-lying parts of Silver Hollow, the poorest section of town, where the homesteaders whose homes had been burned were taking refuge in sheds and tents, was directly in the path of the flood's main force. Panic erupted. The town's main street became a river of chaos. People ran screaming from their homes, trying to herd livestock and children to higher ground. The single wooden bridge that connected the two halves of the town groaned under the assault of the current, its timbers popping like gunshots. Through the chaos, two figures emerged as anchors of calm. Anna, her face set with a grim determination she had never known she possessed, rode her mule straight to the church, the highest and most solid building in town. Here she shouted, her voice ringing out with an authority that silenced the panic around her. "Bring the children and the elderly here at Stone. It will hold." People, desperate for a leader, obeyed without question. She began to organize, her mind working with the same clarity she had applied to Ada's legal documents. She directed men to tear down fences for wood to reinforce the church doors. She sent women to the mercantile to gather blankets, bandages, and what little food they could salvage. The church, once the seat of Prudence Hart's judgment against her, became Anna's command post, a sanctuary against the raging water. While Anna built a fortress, Elias waged a war. He was on his buckskin, a man transformed. The quiet, haunted scout was gone, replaced by a master of his environment. The horse and rider moved as one, a single entity against the fury of the flood. The churning water that terrified others was, to him, just another landscape to be read. He saw the currents, the eddies, the treacherous submerged debris. He plunged his horse into the chest-deep water, riding to the cluster of shacks where the homesteaders were trapped. The water was a living thing, trying to pull the horse's legs from under it, but Elias held it steady with an iron will. He reached the Miller family, who were clinging to the roof of their collapsing shed, the water rising around them. He coiled his rope. The children first he roared over the din, one by one. He lassoed the terrified children, pulling them through the current to the back of his horse, which stood like a rock in the torrent. He ferried them to a small rise of land, then went back for their parents. He became a legend in those hours, a lone rider appearing out of the spray and chaos, his rope a lifeline, his quiet commands a beacon of hope. But another, more sinister drama was unfolding upstream. Mayor Silas Crowell, seeing the main force of the flood threatening the new shaft of Asa Blackwood's silver mine, gathered a handful of his paid cronies. They were not trying to save the town. They were frantically building a crude levee of rocks and logs, a desperate attempt to divert the main channel of the flood. But their diversion had a terrible cost. The new channel they were creating would send the full, unrestrained force of the flood directly into the already swamped residential hollow, sacrificing the people to save the mine. It was arson by water. At that very moment, 300 miles away in a silent, wood-paneled courtroom in Denver, Ada Whitfield stood before a federal judge. Silas Crowell and Prudence Hart sat at the defendant's table, looking smug and confident in their city clothes, flanked by Asa Blackwood's expensive lawyers. "Your Honor," Ada began, her voice crisp and clear, "the plaintiffs will demonstrate a conspiracy of remarkable cruelty, a scheme to use intimidation, forgery, and violence to defraud Mrs. Anna O'Rourke of her rightful inheritance and to illegally seize the property of the citizens of Silver Hollow." She started with the forged summons Elias had found in the snow. An expert witness testified to the freshness of the ink, proving it was not a legitimate court document. Prudence Hart shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Then Ada called her next witness. The prosecution calls Mr. Thomas Garvey. Tom Garvey, his familiar, kind face pale with nerves, but his eyes steady, walked to the stand. Crowell stared at him, his face slack with shock. "Mr. Garvey," Ada asked, "you were employed by Mayor Crowell as a teamster and clerk for nearly 5 years. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And in that time, did you ever have occasion to access the mayor's private files in the town records office?" "Yes, ma'am. He was a sloppy man. Often left his keys." Ada placed a sheaf of papers on the witness stand. "Can you identify these documents?" Tom nodded. "Those are the originals. Land deeds, survey maps, correspondence between the mayor and Mr. Blackwood's office. I made copies. I knew what he was doing was wrong. Trying to steal that land from all those folks. I couldn't stop him, but I could save the proof." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Tom Garvey, the quiet teamster, had been a silent witness, a mole in the heart of the conspiracy. Asa Blackwood's lawyers leaped to their feet with objections, but the damage was done. Back in Silver Hollow, the floodwaters crested. The bridge finally gave way, collapsing into the torrent with a great tearing sound, cutting the town in two. Elias, having rescued the last of the stranded families, saw Crowell's men frantically working on their dam. He understood their intent instantly. With a roar of fury, he spurred his horse across the last bit of stable ground, charging toward them. Crowell's men, seeing the mountain man thundering toward them, a figure of righteous wrath covered in mud and river grime, dropped their tools and fled. In Denver, Ada played her final cards. She introduced the ledger found on Pike Doolin. A handwriting expert confirmed the meticulous entries belonged not to the brutish Doolin, but to Prudence Hart. Her carefully constructed facade of moral superiority crumbled into dust under the weight of her own meticulous bookkeeping. "And finally, Your Honor," Ada said, her voice ringing with conviction, "the prosecution calls Dr. Min Morrison to the stand, a slender, dignified man of Asian descent with kind, intelligent eyes took the stand. He was a traveling doctor, one of the few who would treat the poor homesteaders and miners that the town's official doctor often ignored." "Dr. Morrison," Ada asked, "did you have occasion to treat Mr. Clark after the fire in the West Ravine?" "I did," the doctor replied, his voice calm. He suffered from smoke inhalation and several contusions. "In your medical opinion, were those contusions consistent with being trapped in a burning building?" "No, Doctor," Morrison said firmly. "They were consistent with being struck repeatedly with a blunt object. Furthermore, I treated 2 other men that same week with similar injuries, both of whom had been persuaded by the Doolin brothers to sign over their land deeds to Mayor Crowell." The testimony was devastating. It connected the Doolins' violence directly to Crowell's land grab. With medical proof, the web of deceit, held together by greed and sanctimony, had finally come apart. As the judge in Denver brought down his gavel, finding sufficient evidence to bind Crowell and Prudence over for a criminal trial and to issue a federal indictment against Asa Blackwood for conspiracy and fraud. The flood in Silver Hollow began to recede. The roaring torrent slowed to a muddy flow, leaving behind a landscape of ruin. The streets were thick with a foul-smelling silt, and the wreckage of homes and lives was strewn everywhere. But the town was alive. The people emerged from the church, from the upper floors of their homes, blinking in the pale sunlight. They saw the devastation, but they also saw who had stood with them. They saw Anna, her face smudged with dirt, her fine Denver dress ruined, handing out blankets and directing the search for the missing. They saw Elias, mud-caked and exhausted, riding his horse through the muck, using his rope now to pull a wagon free from the mud. The people of Silver Hollow, who had once whispered about the troublesome widow and the savage mountain man, now looked at them with a new and profound respect. They were not outcasts. They were heroes. Anna walked over to Elias as he dismounted, his body sagging with a fatigue so deep it was a physical weight. The chasm of his past and her future, which had seemed so wide just days before, was gone, washed away by the flood. He had faced the ghosts of his past, the fire, the screams, the helplessness, and had not flinched. He had chosen to be a savior, not a survivor. He had let go of his guilt. And she, in the heart of the crisis, had let go of her fear. She had faced the judging eyes of her community, not with defiance, but with compassion and leadership. She no longer cared what they thought of her. She cared only for their survival. He stood before her, not in the shadows of the forest or the anonymity of a crowded city, but in the full light of day. In the center of the ruined town, he reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and sure. The flood had washed away the lies, the greed, and the corruption that had poisoned Silver Hollow. And in its place, something new and clean had begun to take root. The water had taken much, but it had also delivered a fierce and undeniable justice. ***. Part Saint, Denouement, a home in the Elk Valley ****. The receding floodwaters left behind a world remade, stripped down to mud and truth. In the days that followed, the cleanup of Silver Hollow began. And it was a labor not of law or commerce, but of community. The lines that had once divided the town between the respectable and the outcast, the powerful and the poor, had been erased by the common struggle for survival. And at the heart of this new, fragile unity were Anna and Elias. They worked tirelessly, not as leaders issuing commands, but as neighbors lending a hand. Anna, using the last of her Denver funds to purchase wagon loads of lumber and supplies from a neighboring town, organized the rebuilding efforts. She moved among the families who had once scorned her, offering not pity, but practical help and a quiet, steady presence. The women who had whispered behind their hands now came to her for advice, their eyes holding a new, shame-faced respect. Elias, with a crew of humbled but grateful townsmen, worked to clear the main road and shore up the foundations of damaged homes. They followed his lead without question. They had seen him ride into the flood, a man of impossible skill and courage, and they now saw him as a part of their landscape, as solid and dependable as the mountains themselves. The whispers about the savage mountain man died, replaced by a quiet awe. News from the world outside trickled in, carried by the same supply wagons. The trial in Denver had been swift and decisive. With the evidence from Tom Garvey's saved documents and Prudence Hart's own meticulous ledger, the conspiracy collapsed under its own weight. Silas Crowell was stripped of his office and sentenced to a long term in a federal penitentiary for fraud and conspiracy. Asa Blackwood, the railroad baron, saw his assets frozen and his reputation ruined, his web of corruption undone by a quiet teamster and a resilient widow. The Doolin brothers, with Pike's testimony against his former employers, received lesser sentences for their roles in the arson. And Prudence Hart, she was not imprisoned. Her punishment was, perhaps, more fitting, Stripped of her social standing and exposed as a hypocrite and a criminal accomplice, she endured the ultimate humiliation. She became invisible. One morning, before the town was fully awake, she boarded an eastbound stagecoach with a few small trunks and was never seen in Silver Hollow again. She did not leave with a bang, but with a quiet, ignominious whisper. With justice served and order returning, Anna turned her full attention to the future. She met with Ada Whitfield, who traveled back from Denver to oversee the final legal arrangements. Together, they formally established the Silver Hollow School and Miners' Widows Fund. Anna endowed it with a significant portion of her inheritance, ensuring that no child in the valley would go without an education, and no family would be cast into poverty by the loss of a husband in the mines. Her first act as the fund's director was to offer a full scholarship to the eldest Miller boy, who had lost everything in the fire. Furthermore, she took the vast tract of land in the high pass, the source of all the conflict, and placed most of it into a newly created community trust. The land would be protected from development and speculation, preserved for grazing and managed timber harvesting, with the profits feeding back into the community fund. She had used her power not to enrich herself, but to build a shield around the valley, ensuring that a man like Blackwood could never again threaten their homes. Silver Hollow was healing. A new town council was elected, with honest men who had proven their worth during the flood. The burned-out homesteads were being rebuilt, the new timber smelling of a fresh start. The town was, for the first time, a true community. And it was a community where Anna and Elias were no longer just welcome, they were revered. It was this very acceptance that told them it was time to go home. One crisp autumn morning, with the aspen groves turning a brilliant gold, they packed their few belongings onto the mule. They were not fleeing this time. They were choosing. They said their goodbyes to a small group that gathered at the edge of town: Tom Garvey, Dr. Morrison, the Clark family, and others. "You'll always have a place here," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion as he shook Elias's hand. "We know," Anna said, her smile warm and genuine. "But our place is up there." They rode away from the town they had saved, not with a sense of loss, but of completion. They had faced the world and its corruption and had won. Now, they were returning to the quiet truth of the mountains, to the sanctuary where their own story had truly begun. When they reached the cabin, it was just as they had left it, a silent, sturdy sentinel waiting for their return. It felt different now. It was not a refuge, not a temporary shelter. It was home. The next day, Elias took a plank of smooth, weathered pine, and with the same patient skill he had used on the carved door, he burned 2 names into the wood: Boone O'Rourke Homestead *. He hung it on a post at the edge of the clearing. It was a declaration, a quiet statement of a shared life, a shared future. Their wedding took place a week later. There was no church, no crowd, no ceremony. A traveling minister, a gentle, elderly man making his way to a new parish, happened upon their cabin while seeking shelter from an early snow flurry. They invited him in for a hot meal, and upon learning he was a man of the cloth, they asked if he would do them the honor of marrying them. Their guests were few, but they were the ones who mattered. Ada Whitfield and Dr. Morrison had ridden up from town, bringing with them a small crate of supplies as a wedding gift. Tom Garvey arrived just as the ceremony was beginning, his wide, honest face beaming. Anna wore her simple serge dress, the one she had bought in Denver, but she had woven a crown of late-blooming mountain wildflowers into her hair. Elias wore his clean buckskins. They stood before the hearth, the fire casting a warm, dancing light upon their faces, and they spoke their vows. They were not the prescribed words from a book, but simple promises spoken from the heart. He promised to be her rock, her shelter, her partner in all things. She promised to be his peace, his comfort, his home to return to. Ada wiped a tear from her eye. Tom Garvey blew his nose loudly into a handkerchief. Dr. Morrison simply smiled, a witness to a healing more profound than any medicine could provide. That night, after their friends had departed, Anna and Elias stood on the small wooden porch where he had first draped the deerskin around her shoulders. The sky was a vast, clear canvas of stars, so close and bright it felt as if they could reach out and touch them. The great, violent storm of their lives had passed, leaving behind this deep, unbreakable peace. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against the solid warmth of his chest. They didn't need to speak. Everything that needed to be said had already been proven, in fire and in water, in courtrooms and in the quiet sanctuary of their own hearts. Asterisk, asterisk, epilogue. Asterisk, asterisk. The seasons turned. The deep snows of another winter came and went, blanketing the valley in a profound and welcome silence. As the first signs of spring began to show, Anna stood in the doorway of the cabin, a hand resting on her gently swelling abdomen. She watched Elias, who was sitting on the porch steps, bathed in the soft morning light. He was carving something from a small block of pine. It was a horse, its lines simple but full of life, small enough to fit in a child's hand. He looked up and saw her watching, and the slow, easy smile he gave her held all the peace in the world. A few days later, Tom Garvey made the trek up the mountain, bringing supplies and a letter. It was from Ada. Anna opened it, her fingers tracing the elegant script. Asterisk, my dearest Anna, the letter began. Asterisk, I write to you with the most wonderful news. Yesterday, with funding from your endowment, the new Silver Hollow School officially opened its doors. The children were so excited, their faces shining with promise. They have a new teacher, a fine young woman from the East. She told me the first lesson she planned to teach was the story of the town's founding. I suggested she amend that, and instead teach the story of its refounding. Anna smiled, folding the letter. She looked out at the valley, then back at the cabin, at the carved door that had welcomed her home. Just inside, hanging from a wooden peg, was her father-in-law's brass compass. Elias had hung it there when they returned. Asterisk. A man without a compass is just a man who's lost, asterisk. He had told her. They had both been lost, wandering in their own wildernesses of grief and guilt. But now, the needle had found its true north. It pointed here, to this small cabin, to this shared life, to this quiet, unshakable love. It pointed home. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales. Give this video a thumbs up and hit that hype button to help more people discover this story.